Thank you, Christine. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to IWP, and welcome, Chairman Moolenaar. I just wanted to express my gratitude to you and your colleagues for your signal service to this country in this particular capacity. And we're very grateful and we're honored by your presence here. I wanted to set the stage initially with a kind of a broad-ranging question to you to start this off. Despite decades of U.S. overt and covert assistance to China, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has reciprocated by conducting a myriad of what can only be called Cold War actions against us. It has conducted massive espionage, personal data collection, and technology theft. It continues its tradition of narcotics warfare, now with fentanyl. It has conducted laser tests to blind our satellites. It has taken aggressive gray zone actions against our and our allies' naval vessels and aircraft. It set up an illegal laboratory with dangerous pathogens in California. It conducts a variety of measures of economic warfare against us. It operates 600 front organizations in this country. It has set up police stations here in America to enforce CCP law and threaten Chinese Americans. It has tried to export AK-47s and shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles to Los Angeles criminal gangs, which was interdicted by U.S. Customs. It conducts a massive military buildup and is making preparations for war against us. Then it has worked to psychologically anesthetize us to all this by conducting its three warfare strategy: public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare, which are designed to influence, co-opt, corrupt, and neutralize every major influential group in our country: the media, business, academia, think tanks, Hollywood, retired cabinet members and flag officers, and amongst other things, through TikTok, millions of Americans, including young Americans. Their effort to achieve psychological disarmament has been remarkably successful, and while their cover-up of COVID's origins inspired distrust of the CCP, and while your committee has taken heroic actions to address the threat, our government suffers from a lack of vigilance and urgency. The result is that our strategic response has not been commensurate with the threat. There has been no genuine policy of reciprocity. So my question to you is, what can Congress and the new administration do to implement a serious policy of reciprocity?
Well, thank you for that question, and it's a very good question, and I want to thank you for hosting me here today, and very well said about the different aggressive actions that have been taken. And, Congress and the White House, it's going to be very important that we work in a way that brings the best of America forward, because it is a competition. We call it a strategic competition. And it's going to be important that we win that competition. One of the concerns with the previous administration was they wanted to manage the competition, or, have a floor under with, they didn't want to have, negative relations. I think it's going to have to get more aggressive in terms of our approach to make this relationship authentic and reciprocal, as you point out. So on the trade front, I and others in the committee have introduced legislation that would actually revoke China's PNTR, Permanent Northern Trade Relations, and also end the de minimis exemption, one that would put tariffs directly on China, especially some of these key sectors at 100%, and then at lesser sectors about 35%. So to me, it's important that we send a powerful message that their economic activity the unfair trade policies, the dumping, the unfair subsidies, those things. We have to be reciprocal in that. At the same time, we have to recognize we're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party that promotes itself as wanting to engage and be part of the world order that has diplomacy and authentic relationships. But I want to remind people that at the same time, Xi Jinping was telling President Biden that he would help cooperate on our drug problem in America with fentanyl and see what he could do. Their policy was actually to subsidize, to give a tax rebate to chemical companies in China that were manufacturing the precursor chemicals to the fentanyl that's killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. And so we have to recognize, similar to the days of the Soviet Union, that what the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party says is often very different from the reality, and just we need to be clear-eyed about that. And to your point about the military aggressiveness, in my view, the best way to deter war is what President Reagan used to say, peace through strength. And it's going to be very important that we follow through on our commitments to Taiwan to get them the military, the technology, the weapons, the arms that they need, so that Xi Jinping does not think that they are weak and that the United States is weak, and it does not tempt him into doing something that would be terrible, similar to the way Putin invaded Ukraine. So I think on all these fronts, the economic, the military, the human rights issues, Congress can speak out. One of the benefits of our select committee is we're able to focus with a laser on this relationship with China. And it's going to be important we continue to do that and then work in a collaborative way with the Senate and the White House to get things done.
Thank you. Now, a lot of the actions that we have taken already as a government have been defensive. But a policy of reciprocity, imagine if we had the equivalent of TikTok in China. Imagine that. It's unimaginable. But a serious policy of reciprocity would involve taking some kind of an offensive strategy that would target the regime's greatest vulnerability. In my view, it's its fear of its own people and its fear of democracy. And this is the only arena where we can get the Chinese people to understand that we consider them to be our allies in what is a de facto Cold War. You may want to call it a competition, but I think it's a de facto Cold War against the CCP, and give the Chinese people the hope that they can eventually realize political change. So then how can we bolster our soft power, including the ability to communicate with the Chinese people, strengthen the non-military instruments of conflict, which are completely neglected in this government, such as political warfare and psychological strategy, in order to help move the Chinese people from their psychology, their fatalistic acceptance of the permanence of communist rule, and their sense of futile resignation when it comes to the ability to bring about political change, and move them to a psychology of greater hope for a future where their human rights are protected.
Well, that should be the goal. And I believe that is the goal. The challenge is the tools, the mechanisms that we've used in the past. We need to come up with new ideas. When it comes to communication, they have such a firewall that it's very difficult to get those messages to the people. And, I always talk about my love for the Chinese people, but it's the Chinese Communist Party that's the problem, because, China is very quick, CCP, to label anything negative about the CCP as anti-Asian or somehow anti-China. But to your point, in the Cold War, there were very good mechanisms to communicate to the people, behind the Iron Curtain. And I think we need to develop new strategies in that area. And I think we also need to continue to build bridges with like-minded countries to work together on that. One of the big issues right now is, how do we engage with the rest of the world to counter the Belt and Road Initiative? Because China is, they're bribing countries, they're, doing shoddy workmanship on different projects, creating debt in developing countries. But then the question is, what is America's role helping those countries develop? And we've had tools in the past, but I think it's important that we really rethink those tools and see what's effective, what isn't, and how we can build these relationships using our private capital markets as a real tool so that we're investing in countries in a way that's sustainable and benefits those countries so they don't feel like they're being used, but they actually are growing with the American economy. And to me, right now is a very important time to rethink what we've done in the past and innovate with new ideas.
I should mention that our ability to communicate with foreign publics, and particularly with people in denied areas with no free press, has been a completely neglected element of our government. The entire U.S. Agency for Global Media has a budget of only $1 billion. And here, Rick Grinnell and Elon Musk think that the whole thing should probably be VOA and our Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty should be even shut down. During the Reagan administration, we managed to get $8.3 billion in today's dollars to strengthen the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty, precisely to overcome jamming, to broadcast from many different directions, to broadcast 24 hours a day, and so on and so forth. But this requires national strategic attention. It cannot be relegated to this tertiary, the orphan child of an agency that is totally neglected at the national strategic level. Anyway,
Can I respond to that? Because I think you're absolutely right. We need to re-engage in this area, but we also need to be creative and think outside the box. And in some ways, some of the chaos that's happening right now with foreign aid and, people very concerned about it, I think as we dig into this, we're going to find out what's been working and what hasn't been working. What have we always been doing that really hasn't shown results? And then how do we innovate to a new way of promoting American interests, American values, and being clear on what those values are? I would hear from leaders of different countries who were offended by what was being promoted by our embassies as American values. They were thinking that's the last thing our country wants. And so we need to think about how to strategically relate to different nations and build those bridges. But I think the way we've always done it, I think has to change, especially because our economies are so intertwined with China and the economies of these other nations. They're being asked to choose one or the other. And I think we need to present a win-win scenario for them and for the United States that makes what's attractive about America what drives them. And I think it's going to take some creative work.
Thank you for that. Terrific. I'd like to ask you another question here. I'd like you to address the problem of the unprecedented levels of espionage and intellectual property theft against us, and even the infiltration of our society. And it's espionage and so on, whether by cyber operations or human intelligence collection. A senior counterintelligence official working in California, one of our alumni, has reported that there are, he estimates, about 25,000 Chinese intelligence collectors in Silicon Valley alone. There are thousands of Chinese graduate students who are beholden to the Chinese intelligence services to report on whatever new information that they can collect about the cutting edge technologies that they learn about from their professors. Many of these students have already have the graduate engineering degrees that they're seeking in the American university, but they've studied the basics. Now they are looking at what the cutting edge stuff is. So there have been reports of some 10 to 20,000 single military age men, far from being indigent, who have come across the border illegally into this country and dispersed throughout the land. And then there's been the emplacement of malware in our critical infrastructure systems. So one can go on about all of this. What can be done to minimize the threat of this infiltration, espionage, and even potential sabotage in a potential conflict?
Well, that is a very important question because most people are not aware of this threat. And that's one of the main goals of our committee, is to expose and bring to light these threats. And so when you think of some of the cyber activity and, whether it was infrastructure or communications, unprecedented. We did a report also on the universities in the United States that are partnering with entities in China and receiving Department of Defense grants and doing joint research. Doing joint research then that the university in China is partnering with the People's Liberation Army to implement the technology on these things. And so we wouldn't have done that with the Soviet Union. But it goes back to this idea that we believed that China was going to be this developing nation, good partner in the world order, and somehow that by exposing them more to American values or American way of life, that their leadership would become more democratic, more freedom-loving. And there's still that mindset. And so when it came to stealing technology or intellectual property, people would kind of say, well, that's what China does. It's a developing country. They're trying to catch up. Well, they aren't a developing country anymore. They are a powerful military-ish country that is on a military wartime footing, developing weapons in a way that threatens the entire world. And so we need to make sure we get that message out, because if you think of the Soviet Union, there was the Sputnik moment where suddenly people realized where the Russians were at when it came to technology and the threat. We haven't had one Sputnik moment, but Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, these hacks should make us aware. The espionage that's been done in my home state of Michigan, there were 5 University of Michigan students that were caught spying at Camp Grayling, where we trained military leaders. And, as publicly reported, we were training Taiwanese military leaders. Now, they said they were stargazing and had all this expensive equipment, that they were in the woods. But you don't hear a lot about that. But the reality is, because of their 2017 national security law, they will leverage any family in China. They will leverage any person in any way to gather information under the threat of, if they don't, they are violating national security laws. So to me, that's kind of ups it so that, any person can be vulnerable to leverage in that. And they're doing that with students. They're doing it with, business leaders. They leverage, we spent some time in Hollywood talking to film producers. And what was very interesting is they were already censoring what they would do, because they wanted their film to be shown in China. But even more than that, they were afraid that if they said something or did something that was offensive, they would no longer be able to show any of their films, because there would be that retaliation against actors, so you see that amount of leverage. So to me, a big part of our role is to expose that and then to develop counter strategies for that.
It's wonderful that you've said this, Congressman. I have my own hypothesis about the problem of a Sputnik moment. when General Milley revealed the hypersonic missile developments, and most recently there have been other of these kind of Sputnik moments. I can hardly wait for further developments that the Chinese have done in quantum computing, for example, and the revolution that can potentially make in terms of breaking encrypted communications and so on and so forth. But the elder statespersons, former cabinet members, and an unseemly number of them, including flag officers, have gone on to work for consulting companies whose main business is opening doors in Beijing to American corporations. And once they get that job, and the American corporation goes and makes some money and pays the former Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State. I mean, there are two former intelligence agency heads who are on the board of a Chinese gambling company on one of the islands in the South Pacific, which generates more money than the biggest casino in Macau. It's an illegal money laundering operation, and yet, but these people, these former senior American officials, will never talk about any dangers coming from China. They'll talk about threat from Russia. They'll talk about the radical Islamists, but they've been neutralized effectively. And I know for a fact that one of these people, one of our former professors here, sinologists, was at a famous think tank, and he started complaining about how some of these former elder statesmen go testify in Congress as if as if they're disinterested, and yet they don't reveal their conflict of interest because they're indirectly on the Chinese payroll. Well, a board member of that particular think tank, a former cabinet secretary, was directly on the payroll of a front company of the People's Liberation Army, and he arranged to have our former professor fired from that think tank. And, well, we ended up hiring him here. But this is a scandal, and I wonder, is it possible to pass legislation to prevent people whose judgment about foreign affairs we should always trust, and whose judgment is not clouded by the fact that they are on the payroll of an adversary of this country, directly or indirectly?
Yeah, I think when it comes to some of the transparency issues, some of the registration kinds of issues for foreign agents, we need to do a better job on that. We also did some reporting on, taxpayer dollars or even retirement, people's retirements going in to fund businesses in China that are partnering with the military and the Chinese military. And when you look at, our whether it's private dollars or public dollars, there's got to be some screening on that. So we have legislation on outbound investment that the goal is to cut that supply of funding off. But when it comes to, the financial incentive, I was amazed at the number of people who I knew who, when TikTok was being discussed, the legislation, suddenly were lobbying for TikTok. And it was quite remarkable. And you kind of go across the board on some of these lobbying areas, and you realize that the Chinese Communist Party has figured out a way to use our system against us, whether it's the, petitioning the government or lawfare. They're very strategic in that regard. And I do believe our laws need to be updated and to reflect that and do further investigations in this area, because I think we've just seen the tip of the iceberg of that.
That's terrific. Now, you mentioned the problem of us investing, America's retirement accounts in Chinese companies that are actually sanctioned. It's illegal to do business with those companies, and yet we help keep them in business by sending our capital and leaving our capital markets open to them. Well, this continues because of the lobbying power of the very Wall Street investment companies that are managing those retirement accounts. Can Congress resist the lobbying power of those investment companies?
I believe yes. We were very close to getting outbound investment legislation through in the last few weeks of the last Congress. It's going to be reintroduced, and we're going to work very hard to move that forward. So I believe the answer is yes, but it's going to take a lot of political will. It's also going to take, I want to believe that most Americans, when they realize the threat that is involved, will want to do the right thing for our country. Now, money, it's been said by others, love of money is the root of all evil, right? So I do believe money is very tempting for people, but I also recognize that, people love the freedoms that we have in this country and the benefits of this country. And when they realize the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to our way of life and even the financial arrangements, trade, routes that, navigation, those kinds of things. When people realize the severity of that will be to hit their pocketbook, I think it will bring more people on board to say, okay, let's figure out what to do best for America because we love this country and we're going to want to do the right thing. But we may have to tell them, and we may have to at times make public statements so people have to respond. I'll never forget being with a very famous business leader who was making a lot of money in China. And he was asked the question, how would you respond if you were asked if there's a genocide going on in China against the Uyghur Muslims? And he sort of squirmed and he said, well, I hope I wouldn't get asked that question. And what it showed me was two things. The financial investment there is incredible. The realization that would tank his business there if he spoke out on that. But he was literally willing to deny that in order to protect that business. And to me, we've got to call that out in a respectful way and give people options to friendshore and other countries and build those relationships with like-minded countries.
Well, Congressman, I want to thank you for what I consider to be ultimately the most important message that you have imparted here, and that is telling the truth about all of this is the most powerful weapon we have. And I know that if our national leadership tells the truth about all of this, the American people will have a good enough judgment to support those policies which will help give us the strength that can deter war and preserve the precious inheritance that we've been given in this country. So I thank you for your part in your moral strategic witness in all of this. It's a gift to our country, and I thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate that very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a few minutes for questions. The speakers will take them. I'll call on you, and I would very much appreciate if you state your name and affiliation and keep your question as brief as possible so we can get a few in.
Hi, Congressman.
How are
Thank
you?
for being here.
Yeah, good to see you.
I'm Haley Birdwill. I'm a reporter with Notice. I just wanted to follow up on what you were just saying about businessmen in China. As you know, Elon Musk has a lot of influence in this new administration. He also has a lot of business interests in China. He opened a Tesla showroom in Xinjiang when human rights abuses there were well known. He just recently opened another factory in China for Tesla. So I'm just curious, having worked on that outbound investment bill that sort of tanked after Elon Musk voiced his opposition to the overall spending package. Do you have any concerns about his influence in this administration? And have you spoken with him about China policy?
I've actually never met Elon Musk. I will say that the outbound legislation, I'm not convinced it was Elon Musk that ended up, there were a lot of challenges with that legislation. We had different committees of jurisdiction that had different viewpoints, and we were trying to do one thing and the Senate was trying to do another thing, and it was kind of in the final week. So I don't believe that was what ended up not allowing that to move forward. But I will say we need to be very clear on what is the best policy for America and work through that in Congress with the Senate. We're actually tonight going to have a dinner with some senators who are very interested in these policies, and we need to work together, and then also with the White House. And I will say in the White House, you got Senator Rubio, who is fantastic on these issues. John Ratcliffe is very good. Mike Waltz. I mean, I have a lot of confidence in the president's team in these areas who very well understand the threat to China. And as we develop the right policies, business will follow the policy. And so the key thing is going to be for us to develop those right policies. And without me, commenting on one business model or another that is legal, we just have to make sure we get the right policy in place, and then the markets have to adjust to that.
Sir.
Thanks so much. Tom McDevitt, Chairman of the Washington Times. Thank you so much for your service. Borrowing from Dr. Lenczowski's experience during the Cold War, my question is about ideology. Not only do the American public and the global public not see what the behavior of the CCP is, but the thought, Xi Jinping thought, the underlying rationale of the CCP system, I think needs much more exposure. I'd like to hear from both of you about that in terms of contrasting the essence of Xi Jinping thought and first principles in America. I think there's a huge opportunity there. What do you think?
Well, thank you, Tom. This addresses the whole question of ideological competition. And it is, the U.S. government does not pay serious attention to this. George W. Bush, for example, said that we are in a war of ideas with radical Islamism. Well, which agency of the U.S. government hires warriors of ideas? What is a warrior of ideas? The answer is no agency of the U.S. government does that. And once upon a time, maybe the U.S. Information Agency had some people like that. You might have some people like that within U.S. AGM. The CIA used to have some people doing that sort of thing in its covert action, political action programs. But what you're talking about here is the nub of the conflict. China, the Chinese Communist Party hates the United States. And just go read what its foreign ministry says about the United States if you want to see some ground truth about their attitudes towards us. And as George Kennan said about the Soviet Union, they hate us not for what we do, they hate us for who we are, because we represent a competing principle of the legitimacy of state authority. Their only principle that legitimizes them in power is Marxism-Leninism with so-called Chinese characteristics, which takes its form as Xi Jinping thought today. But Marxism-Leninism is a Western import that has absolutely nothing to do with traditional Chinese culture, nothing to do with it. And if we were serious about a war of ideas, we would expose this fact to the Chinese people. We would repeat it often. We would rebut the claims of Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics, and we would tell some truth about the fundamental principles underlying our system of rule of law, of respect for the dignity of the individual human person, no matter what their background or condition, the this distrust of centralized power, and so the diffusion of power, the separation of powers, checks and balances, and all of the things that people, I think, in both parties in this country will agree to, and that the constitutional arrangements in this country are amazing if one only learned what they were. But nobody does that anymore. Nobody reads the Federalist Papers. Nobody knows what the Anti-Federalists said and why they argued for the Bill of Rights. And instead, our colleges and our high schools teach our children about how we're systemically racist and we're really the bad guys in the world. Well, just go live. It's an incredibly provincial view, by the way. You just need to go travel somewhere else in the world and find out how racism exists everywhere. And don't just go to the tourist places in Paris. Go talk to people wherever you're traveling. But this is the central issue. And they are scared to death of the democratic principle of legitimacy, because the whole idea of the consent of the governed is something that can animate their biggest fear, which is their internal security threat, the fear of their own people. And the measurement of that fear is just take a look at the size of their internal security apparatus.
I think we have time for just 2 more questions for the chairman.
Oh.
Go.
Please. Well,
Oh, I'm sorry.
he said that very well.
What can the committee do about this? core
So that is when it comes to human dignity, so we've had hearings on some of the oppressive nature of the Chinese Communist Party in China, as well as even transnational repression. When you look at the police stations they had here threatening, when you look at students from Hong Kong who are being, oppression here in the United States on campuses. But we need to do more in terms of how, this is the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence coming up. And I think it's a great time to reflect on these values that were just discussed, because we have something to offer and partners around the world that we can build those relationships. Unfortunately, we've been promoting other agendas around the world, and a lot of countries have rejected those agendas, and they feel like the only way America will relate to me is if I conform to this agenda. And that's very different than what we can do in terms of building bridges. So I think we've got a great opportunity to do that, but we first need to get our own house in order and rally around these principles that we hold dear in this country. Great time to reflect on those in these coming few years. And then by attraction, I think that's how we can build bridges around the world. And also with the people of China. Because I think that if we can get through the firewall, and that's what President Reagan did so well, he reached out to the Russian people with love. At the same time, he was calling out, their leaders for what they were doing to oppress the Russian people.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'd like to sincerely thank you both. Mr. Chairman, thank you, Dr. Lenczowski. And thank you to all of you here for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about our courses and applying to study at IWP, please speak to one of our staff before you leave. And finally, please save the date of October 9th for our special 31st anniversary gala. And finally, last but not least, join me in thanking the 2 gentlemen.